Long ago in ancient times, before elves ever set foot upon the old world, and even before chaos came screaming into existence, the great forest now called Athel Loren was ruled by the tree spirits. These beings reigned in peace over their beloved home, mighty tree men coaxing new life from fresh saplings, while their dryad handmaidens tended to the glorious glades. One of the most beautiful entities within Athel Loren was an immense tree known as Idavach, tended to by the Briarmaven named Drycha. Drycha was a powerful dryad, strong of mind and limb. Her kindness was well known throughout the forest, and she held her court among the widespread roots of ancient Idavach. Highest ranking among the branch wraiths, the beloved dryad had her own force of handmaidens, a right usually reserved for the ancient treemen that lumbered through the boughs of the forest. Like all of her rank, the branch wraith could channel the winds of magic into the very forest itself, providing Athel Loren with sustenance and encouraging its growth. Drycha ruled her part of the forest with grace, until the fateful day that chaos arrived, when madness and war consumed the world. When the hordes of the dark gods washed over the world, Athel Loren quickly found itself under siege. The demons of chaos were drawn to the immense amount of magic that pulsed through the forest's veins, descending upon it in a rampage of flame and claw. Although the dryads and treemen buckled under the initial assault, and much of the great forest burned, it did not take long for the tree spirits to adapt to this new enemy. Drycha, like most of her kind, took on the form of a horrific and fierce tree creature with hands made of iron-hard bark. This war aspect, as it came to be known, allowed the dryads to fight back against their hated enemy. Drycha led her handmaidens into countless skirmishes, casting back the repulsive demons from her glade time after time. She often caught the enemy unaware, leading a force out of seemingly thin air as her magic allowed them to approach unseen. As the war raged on, Athel Loren was able to halt the advance of chaos, thanks to having the buffer of what is now known as the Grey Mountains guarding its back. The tree spirits had finally gained the upper hand, and were slowly recapturing territory from the enemy, though the price had been mighty indeed. Like all of the other races upon the world, the tree spirit's very nature had been corrupted by the hateful influence of chaos. The dryads especially had come to be full of malice and hatred, their cruelty almost to the level of the enemy they now fought. Even Drycha began to slip slowly into this hateful state, though she resisted it much better than most of her kin. This degradation did not go unnoticed by the elders, however. The likes of Dorthu and Odenhu were greatly concerned about the future of their beloved home, and it was because of this concern that they decided to ally themselves with the Elves. Many of the tree spirits hated this alliance, foremost among them being the elder Coadil and practically all of the branch wraiths. For the Elves were tasked with tending to and guarding the forest, usurping the position of the likes of Drycha. For with the Elves and their superior magic tending to the various groves, the branchways were no longer as important and their authority in the forest began to wane. She despised these interlopers, not realizing that it was such feelings of disdain that had caused Dorthu to bind the Elves to the forest in the first place. Drycha wandered around the glades, carefully watching the newly named Azrai for any signs of treachery. For years she maintained her ceaseless vigil against this blooded life, her bitterness growing as the Elves caused the forest to be dragged into various wars. The Briarmaven loved her kin dearly, and felt great sorrow at each death, enshrining the fallen spirit's name into her memory as a reminder of why the Elves must be cast out. How many hundreds of thousands of her kind died to greenskins, dwarves, and worse, in the name of guarding the repulsive and weakling wood elves? The forest had been stronger without them, It had grown wild and free. Despite all of this, and the endlessly growing tally of deceased tree spirits she whispered, the Dryad could not find any true reason to act against the Elves. That is, until the Queen Ariel drew the attention of Morgur. The mutated Master of Skulls led his initial invasion of Athel Loren, tides of beastmen swarming over the realm in an orgy of death and destruction. Drycha fought alongside the elves and tree spirits in this war, desperately trying to slay the terrible creature and cast back the wretched children of chaos. Despite every effort made by the Wood Elves, the Corruptor eluded defeat again and again as his madness slowly turned the forest against itself. Drycha would be leading her handmaidens to victory, only to watch as some of her kin fell into insanity and turned upon their elven allies, thus allowing the beastmen to escape. The Briarmaven of Woe cursed the incompetence of the elves as the war dragged on. For every second Morgur remained alive, the forest suffered more. Eventually, Morgur began carving his way towards the various sacred glades in Athel Loren, corrupting them one by one. The Wood Elves fought desperately to prevent these atrocities, and finally would succeed in Drycha's own glade. It was upon the roots of ancient Idavoch that the final battle was fought against the Beastmen warherds. As the fighting raged on, none fought harder than Drycha and her handmaidens. This was her court, her home that had finally come under assault. She unleashed horrific magics to swallow minotaurs into bottomless pits, impaled countless bestigors on her bloody talons, and brought the very trees to life with wrathful screeches. Every wound she took only increased her resolve, transforming her into a whirlwind of death against the vile beastmen. She watched as Morgur the Corruptor was finally engaged by the tree man elder Coadil, who scattered the monster's personal guard. The tree man slammed his massive hand down onto the Master of Skulls, picking him up in ancient gnarled hands in the hopes of crushing the abomination. Queen Ariel saw this as her chance, and with all of the power she could unleash, the Mage Queen blasted Morgur with a barrage of arcane power. Despite the gifts of the Dark Gods, even he could not withstand such might, and finally was obliterated into a bloody pulp. Drycha felt relief surge through her body as the beastmen scattered with the Corruptor's death. Yet the moment the black blood of the beastman dripped from Coadil's hands onto the roots of Idavoch, she felt an agony that cannot be described with mere words. Every tree spirit in the glade collapsed in suffering, the elves watching on in horror as the thick blood soaked into the very earth. Corruption surged up the roots of Idavoch at an alarming rate, causing horrid mutation and death through a tree older than most of the mortal races. In a matter of moments, it was over. The mighty tree had perished, and in its place stood a blackened husk that wept pus from open sores. Drycha wailed in agony as her home was destroyed before her very eyes. The elves quickly retreated from the area, the various spell weavers and Ariel seeking to contain the corruption as quickly as possible. The once beautiful glades surrounding Idavoch had become a festering ruin of death and decay, forever known afterwards as the Glade of Woe. Nothing wholesome would ever grow there again. Idavoch itself was renamed the Tree of Woe, a permanent reminder to the elves of the distorting power of their foe. To Drycha and her handmaidens, however, the Tree of Woe represented something far darker. The elves had caused the death of her home. They had been the ones to draw Morgur's attention. They had been the ones who allowed him to build up enough of a force to invade the forest. And they had been the ones who spilled his wicked blood in her grove. What little mercy or reason she had in her frigid heart died that day, and Drycha swore she would do anything to see the elves destroyed. Thus did the Briarmaven of Woe begin her secret campaign against the wretched Azrai. She knew that destroying the likes of Ariel and Orion would be a difficult task to accomplish. Thus, she decided to bide her time until an answer came to her. She watched with interest as years later, the Treeman elder Coadil attempted to usurp the elves by preventing Orion's rebirth. Although he was defeated, as he was sealed away within the Wildwood by barriers of immense power, Drycha finally found her answer. She visited Coadil numerous times, whispering secrets to the immense tree man and letting him know of her plans. The two grew to be allies, and Drycha swore her loyalty to one of Athel Loren's two remaining elders. The time had finally come for Drycha to enact her plans. First, the Briarmaven unleashed her wrath upon the lands of fair Bretonnia, gathering to her a massive war whale of forest spirits hungry for slaughter. As innocent peasants and wandering knights were ripped limb from limb, the noble warriors of the king rallied to the banner of the Duke of Carcassonne. The chivalrous knights met the Dryads' army at the crossing of Brionne, and despite all of their valor were slain to a man. Drycha knew no mercy for these lesser beings, more than happy to shred the flesh of blooded life so that it might nourish the land around it. With the Bretonnian corpses feeding the soil of Brionne's forests, the Briarmaven turned her attention towards the walls of L'École Abbey. The defenders hoped that the strong fortifications could hold until reinforcements arrived, the ancient stones having repelled many prior sieges by beastmen and worse. Yet such dreams were dashed as enraged treemen smashed their gnarled fists against the battlements, causing great tears in the wall. Dryads and treekin poured in through the gaps, cutting down all before them. Drycha led the advance, impaling men on her iron-hard talons and summoning roots from the earth to trap and squeeze screaming longbowmen until they were crushed to bloody pulps. She forced her way into the inner sanctuary, ordering her handmaidens to steal a number of artifacts before returning to the battle. Mere hours later, reinforcements from the King of Bretonnia arrived to do battle, only to find the abbey torn down and ruined. Drycha secreted the holy relics away somewhere deep within the secret paths known only to the forest spirits in Athel Loren. She couldn't afford to be constantly on the offensive and risk being noticed by the likes of Ariel or Nyeth the prophetess. Thus, she waited for over 200 years before making her next move. Opportunity came knocking when the beastmen the Azrai called Mograk led the largest invasion of Athel Loren to ever occur. Although we'll cover the war in more detail in a future video, the entirety of the forest came under assault, even the maddened forest spirits of the Wildwood. Drycha decided to make her stand alongside Coadil in this region, reveling in the slaughter of their ancestral enemies. When the slaughter at Bleak Meadow finally resolved, and the mysterious Mograk was cast back to the land of the Empire, the Briarmaven made her next move. For her plan to truly work, she needed certain individuals to play their parts in her scheme. Thus, she traveled secretly through the world routes to the desolate realm of Nagaroth. She tracked down the hag sorceress Morathi, stalking the Drycha through the bleak pines until it was finally time to kill. Morathi was searching for a legendary artifact named the Crown of Sotek within the Black Forest, and thus was caught unawares as shadow warriors of Ulthuan unleashed a volley that scythed down the Dark Elf's guard. With no time to summon dark magic to defend herself, the hag sorceress realized she was going to die. That was, until the trees themselves came alive and tore the Asur to ribbons. Dryads came screaming out of the shadows and butchered the shadow warriors with cruel efficiency, before vanishing just as quickly. Morathy and her remaining escort were thus left dazed in a glade filled with corpses, unsure of what had just occurred. With another goal accomplished, the Branch Wraith returned once more to Athel Loren for about 200 years. Drycha waited for the elves' attention to wander before gathering yet another large war whale, and this time setting off for the Empire. She had discovered the location of yet another relic she required, this time guarded in a shrine of Tal. Once more using the world roots, the army of forest spirits erupted into the Reichwald with no warning and slaughtered the defenders. The vengeful Branch Wraith cut down huntsmen without pause as she pushed for the inner sanctum, failing to notice as one of the wounded men escaped to Altdorf. The huntsman managed to only warn the capital of the shrine's peril before passing from his grievous wounds, and the Emperor ordered an army to be sent immediately to combat this threat. The forces of the Empire gathered and marched immediately to the aid of Tal's holy shrine, but we'll cover that event in the famous battle section. In the end, Drycha managed to claim the Fang of Talroth, the holiest relic of the nature god. With this, she sped back to Athel Loren and prepared for the first of her plans to come to fruition. Only 50 years after her return to the Great Forest, the Briarmaven led numerous raids into the lands of Paravon, searching for the final relic. Hundreds of humans were cut down as the tree spirits surged across the land, tearing apart various holy sites of the Lady of the Lake. Even mighty Grail Knights maintaining vigils over their shrines were unable to defeat Drycha, her horrific magic putting them on the defensive before she would leap forward with a screech and impale them upon her claws. At long last she found the final relic and returned triumphantly to the Wildwood, ready to start the fall of the Wood Elves. When winter finally settled in the imperial year of 2517, Drycha made her move. While most of the forest slumbered and the elves had their attention turned to guarding their borders, the Briarmaven of Woe approached the edge of the Wildwood. The barrier Queen Ariel had erected was impossible to pass or destroy, even with the titanic strength of the likes of Coadil. The Elder had been trapped along with all of his handmaidens and sympathetic treemen for nearly 3,000 years, doomed to ponder over his betrayal. Thanks to the efforts of Drycha, however, he would be bound no longer. With a piercing shriek, Drycha unleashed the combined power of the relics she had gathered. Containing large fragments of various nature gods, the Branch Wraith channeled this power into an explosion against the barrier, and even Ariel's magic could not stand. The barrier shattered, and Coadil was finally unchained. The Azrai rushed to the Wildwood to confront the Elder, only to find the region completely empty. With her lord finally free once more, Drycha had successfully set in motion events she believed would cause the death of the usurpers. The elves would finally pay for causing the downfall of the forest after thousands of years. All she needed to do now was tie up one final loose end. Only a few years after the release of Coadil, Malobad the Black Serpent rode out from accursed Musalin and started a civil war. King Leonker told his dukes to gather to suppress this evil as a united front, but alas, Duke Armand of Aquitaine believed he could conquer it alone. The Duke rode out and found himself aided by none other than the Fey Enchantress herself, Morgiana Le Fay, the Lady's Herald. The Fey Enchantress hoped to end Malobad's rebellion swiftly, for she knew dark times were coming, and Bretonnia would need to be prepared. However, even with the Enchantress's aid, Duke Armand found himself losing as he engaged the dark hosts of the Black Serpent. Malobad was a terror upon the battlefield, and the Bretonnians were dangerously close to being defeated. It was at this time that Drycha and her handmaidens charged out of the nearby forest, slamming into Malobad's flank and giving the Bretonnians much-needed relief. Armin's heart soared as his new allies joined the fray, causing the knights to rally and fight on. Yet Drycha had no interest in the Bretonnians' victory, and almost as quickly as they had arrived, the forest spirits vanished. With the Dryads gone, the Duke found that his defeat had been merely delayed rather than prevented. In his final moments, he realized with horror that when the tree spirits had vanished, so too had the Fey Enchantress. Of her fate, no Bretonnian knew. That completes the story of Drycha leading up to the end times, which she played a notable part in. Though of course we'll discuss that once we get to the relevant segment. However, let's go ahead and move on to equipment. Being a forest spirit, Drycha doesn't actually have any weapons or armor in the traditional sense, like most characters in the Warhammer world. However, being a dryad, she is a shapeshifter, and the state of her body is worth noting. When it comes to protection, Drycha has perfected her war aspect, as it's called, to make her bark flesh harder than iron. She's able to deflect most weapons just using her limbs, though the Briarmaven is infamously swift in combat. Her form is quite literally hatred and bitterness personified, and thus is generally perfected for avoiding and negating damage dealt to her by enemies. That being said, she's not actually made out of wood like treemen or treekin are. As she's a shapeshifter, this is just the way she just appears to look like she's made out of bark, as opposed to actually being a tree given form. Thus, those who think to rely on flame to wound her will quickly find themselves torn to shreds. When it comes to dealing damage, Drycha is a more than capable opponent. Despite the appearance of having wooden fingers, her dagger-like talons can easily shear through steel to tear at frail flesh beneath. Many knights or dwarves have thought themselves safe beneath thick armor before having the branch wraith's claws stab through into their still beating hearts. Only a fool would underestimate the strength of the Briarmaven of Woe, but even the wise quickly find themselves providing nourishment for hungry saplings. With that out of the way, let's go ahead and move on to her skills. A powerful and ancient spirit, Drycha has spent millennia mastering the winds of magic that flow through Athel Loren. The very lifeblood of her home, the branch wraith is more than capable of coaxing massive roots from the earth and blossoming saplings into mighty oaks. Despite these powers hinting at mastery over the wind of Gyran, known to humans as the Lore of Life, Drycha's power actually lies within the wind of Olgu. The Briarmaven wields the Lore of Shadow with terrifying skill, able to cloak herself and allies within the darkness of the forest, or crossing vast distances in mere moments. With shadow magic, she is able to navigate the most secret paths of Athel Loren that not even the Elves are aware of. Her power over magic is so immense that the Branch Wraith was able to overwhelm the magical might of Malekith the Witch King after he had been infused with the Lore of Shadow. Though it should be noted that during this struggle, Malekith had begun to slowly feel the numbing effect of some poison in his veins from a previous wound, though it did not slow him down much. Despite her tree-like appearance, suggesting a slow or ponderous type of movement, Drycha is one of the swiftest beings in Athel Loren. The tree spirit can launch a barrage of attacks that even battle-hardened Chaos or Vampire Lords struggle to deflect. This plays a key role in her fighting style, which relies entirely on lightning-fast raids that catch enemies unaware. Ignorant to their peril, most foes are ripped limb from limb before even being aware that they're under attack. Another rather unique trait of Drycha is the tree spirit's sheer hatred for practically everything in the Warhammer world. Such malice pumps through her heart that the Briarmaven only grows stronger should the enemy manage to wound her. The searing agony of blades piercing the Branch Wraith's flesh only invigorates her to unleash such destruction that even a savage orc would be given pause. The closer she comes to death, the more dangerous she becomes. The reason for this primarily has to do with the fact that she is a dryad, therefore a shapeshifter. So the more iron her will, the more potentially dangerous, or shall we say destructive, her aspect is. When it comes to utilizing her rage, however, increasing her combat capabilities is not the only skill Drycha has developed. Whenever she sights an enemy to assault, the Branch Wraith always launches into battle with a piercing shriek that echoes throughout the forest to terrifying effect. Such vitriol infects the very trees, awakening them to vengeful wrath in a matter of seconds. Slumbering dryads snap to enraged wakefulness and join the Briarmaven of Woe's werewield, swelling her ranks and surrounding the enemy instantly. Whenever Drycha appears upon the battlefield, her army is the very land itself, which will gladly shed blood in sympathy to her madness. When it comes to leading her warwields, Drycha is infamous for erupting out of the trees without warning and cutting down surprised enemies. The combination of her shadow magic, rousing the very forest to wrath, and immense speed allow the Briarmaven of Woe to essentially have a guaranteed ambush against her enemies. There is no creature in all of Athel-Loren who is nearly as stealthy as Drycha, so should your forces be walking by dark forests, always beware of incurring her wrath. On that note, let's go ahead and move on to Drycha's famous battle, the Massacre in the Drychwald. The lone huntsman from the Shrine of Tal managed to reach Altdorf and warned the capital of the assault before dying of his wounds. The emperor of the time, likely Emperor Luitpold, quickly gathered an army and ordered them to go reinforce the holy site. The soldiers of the empire made great haste down the Altdorf-Wiseman road, far too focused on making good speed rather than being cautious. As they marched beneath the branches of the Reichwald, it didn't take long for the humans to notice the eerie sound of creaking wood. Even more unsettling was the whispers. It was as if some chill wind was constantly murmuring in a tongue no man understood. The poor fools did not realize it was Drycha's voice drifting around them, her ceaseless tally of fallen tree spirits the only hint at the slaughter about to be unleashed. Once the entire Empire contingent was well within the forest, the Briarmaven of Woe made her move. She leapt out of a tree's shadow with a piercing shriek, impaling a halberdier with her talons before moving on to the next in a blur. The forest went from a tense silence to a screaming hellscape in an instant, the trees responding to Drycha's call by lashing out with thick branches and whipping vines. Soldiers screamed in terror as they were torn apart by bloodthirsty limbs, panic coursing through the army. Yet the assault had only begun. Following after the Branch Wraith came scores of dryads, wailing in rage as they tore handgunners into bloody shreds and swarmed over isolated groups of swordsmen. Troll-sized treekin emerged from ahead of the regiment, slamming into pistoliers and outriders like a tide. With their horrific strength, they shattered horse spines with each swing, crushing fallen riders beneath their tread as they pushed deeper into the fighting. Finally came the treemen, the lumbering ancients stomping on spearmen like ants and bringing their massive fists down to crush small bands of soldiers into red paste. Completely surrounded, the Imperial soldiers had only their discipline to rely on, and quickly rallied as their captain called for order. The brave commander charged alongside his greatswords regiment towards Drycha herself, hoping to silence the tree spirit's obvious leader. The Briarmaven turned her wrathful gaze upon the encroaching warriors, and with a gesture, thick roots exploded out of the earth, entangling many of the heavy infantry. The captain was swifter than his men, however, and managed to avoid the grasping roots, closing the distance between him and Drycha. This proved to be a mistake, as the Briarmaven of Woe exploded into a frenzied series of attacks, scoring numerous small wounds on her foe. The captain managed to ward off the most deadly of these blows, struggling to find an opening against the forest spirit. In a bold move more dependent on luck than skill, he lashed out with his sword and cut deep into Drycha's shoulder. The Branch Wraith staggered for a moment, backing away even as the greatswords finally freed themselves from the clutching roots. Suddenly, the duel was ended in an instant. Hatred fueling her every movement, Drycha surged forward faster than any mortal eye could hope to follow, and pierced the captain's chestplate. Her iron-hard talons stabbed fully into the man's flesh, before the branch wraith began to push outwards with her terrifying might. Bones snapped, and a terrifying ripping sound echoed over the fighting, as Drycha tore the man in half before turning her malice onto the greatswords. She charged forwards, dashing among them to slit throats and tear out still-beating hearts with contemptuous ease. It was at this moment that much-needed aid arrived for the surrounded men of the Empire. The knightly orders of the Nature God had arrived, led by none other than the Knights of Tal's Fury, the legendary Demigryph Order. They slammed home into the forest spirits, scattering dryads and cutting down aged treekin. Sensing the enemy had been delayed long enough, Drycha cried out an order and channeled the winds of Ulgu to her. As the humans rallied to their mounted saviors, unnatural darkness consumed the road. The brave knights of Tal cried out in vengeance and charged down the road despite the swirling blackness, hoping to catch their vile enemies. Yet the shadows suddenly vanished, gone as quickly as they had spawned. Where once had been an entire war-weald, now only the corpses of the dead remained. The survivors of the Empire pressed onwards to the shrine, hoping there was still time to save it. Alas, they arrived to find the holy site a crumbling ruin. After many hours of searching, the faithful of Tal mourned as they realized the enemy had stolen one of their most sacred artifacts. The legendary Fang of Tal Roth was gone. And that concludes the famous battle section for Drycha, the Briarmaven of Woe. So let's go ahead and move on to everyone's favorite, I know, the Endtime Section. Obviously, if you don't care for the End Times, you can go ahead and click the annotation on screen to skip it, or if you have not read the End Times yet, spoiler warning. So, Drycha is actually easily one of the architects of the End Times. She actually played a deceptively important role in the end of the world. One of the most important things that she did, besides of course freeing Coadel the Cunning, who's one of the Treeman elders of the modern era, was that she kidnapped the Fey Enchantress of Bretonnia. Obviously, without the Fey Enchantress to guide them, the Bretonians were severely weakened and were not able to combat Malobod the Black Serpent. And this led to the Civil War being far more devastating than it would have been had the Fey Enchantress been there to rally the Bretonians properly, or at the very least bolster them with her very, very potent magics. They might have stood a better chance than they ended up standing in the end times. As for what she did with the Fey Enchantress, Drycha actually delivered her and the remaining relics that she gathered leading up to the end times to none other than Manfred von Karstein. She actually formed an alliance with him, not because Manfred sought her out, but because she knew what he was up to, and she practically just freely gave him the Fey Enchantress, and Manfred didn't really even understand why. But the Fey Enchantress was very crucial to Manfred's plans, the first of which being covering Sylvania and in permanent darkness, and the second of which being resurrecting Nagash. Drycha directly set those events in motion. She also obviously protected Morathi, which led to a lot of shenanigans with Ulthuan, in that if Morathi had not been alive for the Cain events, then Ulthuan might still have sank, but it would have been a much less ridiculous affair. Drycha would not be seen for the remainder of the end times until the very, very end, when all of the incarnates and other various individuals were gathering to Athel Loren. So in the final book, there was one major fight in Athel Loren before the incarnates outside of the elves gathered to Athel Loren. So when it was just Malekith, the incarnate of Shadow, and Alariel, the Incarnate of Life. They were by the Oak of Ages, and Drycha and Coadel were approached by Be'lakor, the first demon prince. Be'lakor, using his very infamous skill at manipulation and appealing to the bitterness and hatred that was so deeply ingrained within Drycha and Coadel, convinced the forest spirits to ally with him, to join forces with him to defeat the Wood Elves. Drycha and Coadel had become so entrenched in their own madness that they legitimately believed that if the Wood Elves could be destroyed, that Athel Loren would return to its glory days. Obviously, this was the exact opposite of true, but it's important to understand that they were so far gone because of their own bitterness and because of the fact that Morgur's blood had corrupted both Drycha and Coadel. They were completely insane. So, they allied with Be'lakor, who was leading a demonic army that spawned in Athel Loren due to events we'll talk about another time. Helebron was leading the remaining Cainites, who basically went crazy and gave themselves over to Khorne. And Drycha and Coadel led a huge force of completely insane forest spirits. So a gigantic battle erupted around the Oak of Ages, and it was a huge fight all out on all sides. Coadel almost succeeded in killing Alariel, the Incarnate of Life, but he was defeated by his own brother, Dorthu. Not, of course, brother as in actual relatives, but they were the only two remaining elders of Athel Loren. So they're like the equivalent of the Slann for Athel Loren. And Dorthu, I think it really harmed him on an emotional level. It was actually a very, very depressing fight to read, but Dorthu ended up overpowering Coadel and killed him, and became the only elder to still be alive. Drycha ended up going up against Malekith. Now, Malekith had just fought off the Dark Elf assassin Shadowblade and killed him. But in the process, Shadowblade had managed to wound Malekith with some pretty serious poison, but due to Malekith being the Incarnate of Shadow, it had virtually no effect. Like, the effect was minimum, and he was riding Seraphon, the big, scary black dragon. Well, Drycha, after Coadel died, decided to try and solo Malekith, and contrary to what you may think, she was winning by a bunch. When the two went at each other, she summoned an absurd amount of roots up from the ground, and was basically able to snag Seraphon and drag her down into the ground, and was trapping Malekith as well. And then she ran up, and between her life magic, which she uses a lot in the lore even though she doesn't have access to it in tabletop, her shadow magic, and then her just ridiculously good skill at fighting, she was trashing Malekith. He was going to lose. He was dying. He wasn't dying from like the poison or anything. She had an advantage, and the roots were literally getting to the point that they were just going to crush him and Seraphon. That is, if Drycha didn't behead him first. But as they were fighting, Be'lakor, of course, pulled what demon princes do and did his big betrayal. And he attacked the Oak of Ages and attempted to consume its essence, which would have, of course, instantly killed Athel Loren and made him into a god. Well, the moment he started attacking the Oak of Ages, Drycha, for the first time in thousands of years, finally snapped out of her madness and realized that she had been played the fool. And so she turned to confront Be'lakor, letting all of her magic fade off Malekith, and decided that she would stand with the Incarnates and be a good guy in the end times. Unfortunately, Drycha had been dueling Malekith, and Malekith's kinda bad about holding grudges. So when Drycha turned to go face Be'lakor, Malekith basically leaned forward in his saddle, struck out with his sword, and beheaded Drycha in a single blow and killed her. Because he decided it would be better to have a dead potential ally than a living potential enemy. So that, unfortunately, is how dear Drycha died. She was beheaded by someone she decided to spare. And that concludes Drycha for the end times. All right, and last but not least, let's of course do my gush session on Drycha and talk about the potential of her as a character in Total War Warhammer, as we do with all special characters. Drycha, in my opinion, is one of the more interesting, undervalued characters, in that she exists within the Wood Elf book. But if I had to really dig for like majority of the lore that I went over in this video, and for instance, the famous battle section, much like what I did with Azhag, was I took an event that happened and I decided to add a lot of fluff to it. We have no idea what the events of the Massacre of Reichwald were. All we know is that the Empire deployed reinforcements that went along the Altdorf Wiesen Road, and while they were on that road, they were ambushed by a force of Dryad, Treemen, and Treekin. And at some point, the Empire managed to break through and make it to the temple and see that Drycha and her handmaids had already destroyed it and were gone. Of course, since that was the fight I decided to focus on, I added a bit of flavor to it. Hopefully, I did that with the Aztec video, and you guys seem to be okay with that, so hopefully everyone's okay with that here too. Because I make it as interesting as I can while keeping it canon focused. In any event, if Drycha were to make it into Total War Warhammer, which she definitely won't be one of the first two for the Wood Elves. If they do 2 Legendary Lords per release for each race, I don't think Drycha would be appropriate to be one of the two. Because she's kind of the anti-hero character for the Wood Elves. She's not really on their side. Like, she cares for Athel Loren. She actually really loves Athel Loren and does everything she can to protect it, and that's always where her interest and her heart has been. But rather than being like a really hardcore guardian of it, she instead kind of went batshit crazy and just started going out of her way to try and get rid of the Wood Elves, because she honestly believed, because of her madness, that they were the ones responsible for the forest being destroyed. It didn't occur to Drycha that these enemies probably would have attacked the forest anyway, and without the elves' help, the tree spirits would have lost. So in any event, if she were to be playable, I think how she would focus is I would want her to be the tree spirit character. Although I expect Dorthu to be a legendary lord before her, Dorthu's more of like a really just hardcore fighter, who would just be a pretty solid general, but would be almost solely focused on his combat capabilities. Drycha, in my opinion, would be much better for ambush, and would be much better for being like the buffer for tree spirits. So if you took her, maybe you'd get like you get a reduced price on dryads, or you would get higher quality ones, or maybe you'd get access to treemen earlier. I also think that it would be really neat if her Rouse to Wrath ability was an actual ability, where she could basically activate it on a forest, and it would cause a unit of dryads to spawn out of the forest. I think having the forest actually attack people would be a little too complicated graphically, but if it was sort of like the Raised Dead for the vampire counts, but instead roused, woke up some ancient slumbering dryads and just added that unit, I think that would be really cool. Another thing, even if they weren't controllable, even if it was just like some crazy chaotic unit, but I definitely think she should be the hardcore ambush character for the Wood Elves. Although that's kind of a big theme for their army as a whole, nobody is as good as ambushing as Drycha. She's the Lore of Shadow character. She's actually one of the only prominent Shadow characters in Warhammer lore, or at least tabletop-wise. But I adore Drycha. She should definitely have a very hate-filled mechanic. It'd be cool if they had something like the more damage she takes, the stronger she gets, as that reflects her tabletop stats, which is, the less, for every wound she's missing, she gets +2 attacks, which is a lot. So it'd be really cool in Total War is, if she's out there fighting and she starts, taking damage and getting low health, if she starts getting some serious damage buffs. I think that would be a really neat mechanic that would really encourage you to be really aggressive with her. Pop out of a forest and slam into the enemy with your force of forest spirits, take advantage of the confusion, tear them apart, and you want Drycha leading the charge because she'd be a really good melee character, and as she obviously took more damage because she's in the thick of the fighting, she would only become more and more scary. But those are just my thoughts on it. I really hope one day she's in the game. That being said, I understand that she's probably one of the more difficult characters to put in, but I have faith. I think CA, if they're willing to edit the lore of Azhag and Grimgor Ironhide as much as they have already with their like starting locations changing, I think a small little tweak to Drycha to maybe make her like, because in tabletop she hates the elves, right? But you can still take wood elves in a Drycha army. So all I would hope that they would do is edit her lore just a little bit to make it make a little bit more sense. Because in tabletop, you just sort of get the lore of, oh, she hates elves, but there's no penalty for actually taking elves with her in your army or as your general. So I hope CA would kind of tweak that just a little bit. That's something GW didn't do super well, in my opinion. But anyway, that pretty much wraps up Drycha, the Briarmaven of Woe. I apologize. It's taken me so long to get out a lore video. I know you guys have been starving for one, but we're back on it. I'm not just doing Let's Plays. We're still sticking with lore videos. There's more to come. I believe Thorgrim Grudgebearer is next, the High King of the Dwarves, and also the Wood Elves Part 2 video will be coming out fairly soon. So stay tuned. Hope you guys enjoyed the video. Let me know what you think in the comment section below. Also, last time we talked about it, everyone was okay with there not being music. Just play your own music in the background or whatever. So let me know if y'all still feel the case on that. Now that I have a better quality mic, it's probably just my voice and there's not all that static in the background. I hope to get a subscription to a music recording service soon. But, we'll talk about all that more in a more relevant video. In any event, thanks so much for watching. I hope you guys enjoyed the lore on Drycha. Let me know what you guys think in the comment section below. Let me know what characters you guys want to see. Thanks so much for watching. Love you all very, very much. I'll see you in the next video. Have a good night.